Good evening to those in eastern and central states. Good afternoon to those in mountain states on the West Coast and in Hawaii. And good morning to those watching from China. I'm Steve Orleans, President of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and I'm pleased to welcome audiences from 81 venues throughout the United States and 4 venues in China to our 10th annual China Town Hall, Local Connections, National Reflections. We created this program 10 years ago in the belief that the U.S.-China relationship is the most important bilateral relationship in the world, one that is defining the 21st century. Since 2007, the program has expanded from just over 30 venues to now over 80, a testament to the growing recognition that getting the relationship right is essential for global peace and prosperity. Our program tonight could not come at a more timely moment. Last year, U.S.-China trade exceeded $600 billion. More than 300,000 Chinese students studied in the United States, and cross-border investment directly supported a combined 1.7 million jobs. The joint ratification of the Paris Climate Agreement inaugurated a new era of Sino-American cooperation despite friction in other areas. As we approach Election Day, we must think about the next 4 years and ways we can work together to address climate change, cyber threats, terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, global pandemics, and other pressing issues. This year marks the 50th anniversary of the committee's founding. Reflecting on the last half-century, we are proud to have played a constructive role at each major juncture in the relationship, from hosting the Chinese ping pong team in 1972 to welcoming to the United States every Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping. The National Committee has worked at the leading edge of Sino-American relations. To commemorate the 50th anniversary of the National Committee and the 10th anniversary of China Town Hall, we can think of no better person to discuss Sino-American relations than Henry Kissinger, the father of the modern U.S.-China relationship. Dr. Kissinger served as National Security Advisor and later Secretary of State in the Nixon and Ford administrations. He has been awarded honors too numerous to list, including, of course, the Nobel Peace Prize, and is the author of over a dozen books on politics and international relations, including one of the finest books ever written on China, called On China. He is currently the chairman of Kissinger Associates, and we are proud to say a vice chair of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. He has been advising American presidents and Chinese leaders since he made his historic secret diplomatic mission to China in 1971. It is an honor to have him here with us tonight. I'd like to thank our partners at all 85 venues and our small but dedicated National Committee staff, which has done an extraordinary job in coordinating this complex nationwide event. Let me also thank our local speakers, a veritable who's who of China experts in America. They have traveled throughout the country without compensation because they believe, as we do, that educating Americans about China will help fashion policies in the long-term interests of the United States. Finally, we also thank the Star Foundation for funding China Town Hall, as well as United Airlines for its support of the program. We are now accepting questions submitted via Twitter. Please tweet us your questions using the hashtag CTH16. Let me now begin with a few of my own questions for Dr. Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. It's an honor to have you here. Let's start with some history of U.S.-China relations. For the younger members of the audience who don't remember or didn't know about your historic visit to China in 1971 when you feigned illness in Pakistan and went off to China, tell us about the state of the U.S.-China relationship at that point. What was the inspiration of your visit, and what did you hope to achieve?
In 1971, China and the United States had not had diplomatic relations for 25 years. There was an embargo on the United States side for buying any Chinese goods, either for import or even buying it abroad. And we had been involved in the Korean War, of course, on opposite sides, and there was constant tension between us. There had been a place, Warsaw had been designated as the one place where we could meet with the Chinese. And there had been 162 meetings of Chinese and American ambassadors that ended in less than an hour. So there was, to all purposes, no contact. In fact, it took us 3 years to figure out approaches to China that both sides could trust and that were technically feasible. So the reason I had to feign illness in Pakistan was because if we had announced that I was going to China, that would have been a diplomatic revolution. So the reason there was this opening to China is because China is a great country. And to keep China excluded from the international system means that you cannot really do all the things you ought to do to have a peaceful world or to get participation of one of the important nations. So President Nixon sent me to China for the purpose of opening relations. I didn't know what I was going to find. The Chinese didn't know what I was going to say. And I had 48 hours a 48 hours window in which we could explain my absence. So it was under great time pressure, and Zhou Enlai and I conducted all of the negotiations. So it was an exciting period. And it ended with an invitation from the Chinese government for President Nixon to visit China.
How important did the Soviet Union factor in your decision?
The Soviet Union was an important factor in two ways. One, it had acted as an adversary all around the world, and we wanted to show that we had other options and that we were trying to broaden the base for international conduct. And it was very important for China because the Soviet Union had moved over 40 divisions to the Chinese border, and the Chinese in 1969 had reason to fear or expect that a Chinese full-scale attack might follow, and border incidents had already started. So both of us had a Soviet reason for opening discussions.
Soon after your visit, the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, after your visit then with President Nixon in Shanghai, where you had the Shanghai Communique on February 28, 1972, the National Committee hosted the Chinese ping pong team. What role did that play? Why was that so important?
Well, the audience has to understand there had been no contact. There had been no visitors from China and no visitors from America to China. And in April of 1973, the Chinese suddenly invited the ping pong team, the American ping pong team that was in Japan for a tournament to China. It was unexpected for us. It was unexpected for the ping pong team. And it was one of the breakthroughs of that period. So,
but what about the Chinese team coming here?
So then,
because you had already we'd established liaison offices at that point.
We had just established liaison offices, but the importance of the Chinese team coming here was that it was the first visit of a Chinese delegation that came to the United States. And I welcomed them at the White House. President Nixon welcomed them. And it was exciting for both sides. Of course, the Chinese ping pong players had never been in the United States. So it was a symbol of what the National Committee does in establishing people-to-people contact between the two sides.
What are the lessons, not necessarily from hosting the ping pong team, but that's part of it. What are the lessons from that period, for U.S.-China policy today?
The most important lesson that we have to learn, not just from that period, but in general, the Chinese have a different history and a different culture from the United States. We have lived securely. The Chinese have always had enemies all around them, and one can mention many differences. So it is important for the people of both sides to get to know each other, and it is extremely important for the political leaders of both sides to understand the way of thinking of the other. And one of the best things that Nixon did, and that I'd like to say contributed to at the beginning, was that in our first meetings, we didn't speak so much of our differences. We spoke of our objectives, and to see whether the objectives could be harmonized. And as these leadership meetings began percolating down to people, and as people could have experiences in each other's country of not only the economists, but also of the way of thinking, I think that is an important, crucial element. There are millions by now, I think, of Chinese who have studied in the United States.
Yeah.
When we came to China, there were no Chinese that had ever studied in the United States, or probably in any Western country.
Yes, very few. Let's jump ahead to this morning's news. So from 1972, let's go to this morning's news, which talked about, I should say this is CCTV news, which talked about the visit of the president of the Philippines to China. He's accompanied by a delegation of 500 business people, and I expect he will leave China with billions of dollars of economic aid, and the business people will leave with a lot of deals. How does this fit in with kind of the Obama administration's pivot/rebalance? Because the Philippines were, one of our treaty allies, and how does this kind of fit into what is going on? And in fact, Gray from Chapel Hill, North Carolina, asks, is this a sign that the pivot has not been successful?
Well, I was not a great advocate ever of the word pivot, because basically the pivot was that we withdrew forces from Afghanistan and didn't change much in Asia, But as a result, the percentage of our forces in Asia was larger than it had been before. So the policy of the Philippines, or of any country, my view is each country has to know what its national interest is without lectures by the United States. The Philippines have an alliance with the United States, not as a favor to the United States, because they think that for their own security reasons, they are safer by having a relationship with the United States. If they get a different view, that's their privilege. That is something that countries do. I don't consider a visit by the Philippine president to China as abrogating the American alliance. And I'm in any case opposed to the notion that relations between China and the United States should be measured by the military dividing lines that exist between them. So if the Philippines want closer relations with China, this is not something to which the United States should object. If the relationships then go further and affect other aspects of the relationship, we'll have to deal with it when it arises.
But the Philippine president has announced that obviously the treaty alliance remains intact, but joint exercises with the U.S. military the one that is going on will be, he has announced, will be the final one.
Well, the question is who gains more from these exercises, they or we?
Yeah.
And so I don't think countries do us a favor by having an alliance with us.
Mm-hmm. You've met more Chinese leaders, I think, than any American has. Can you talk about how President Xi Jinping is similar to previous leaders, how he is different? And Zhi Jing from Cambridge adds, what do you think of President Xi's anti-corruption campaign?
Well, the Chinese have had 5 generations of leaders, in my experience, and in fact in the history of the People's Republic.
Right, and you've met with every generation.
And I've met with every generation. And each generation has sort of reflected the needs and the experiences. The Mao generation created the state. They had fought the wars. And they were at the very beginning of economic development. They were more concerned with ideology than with economics. The Deng generation began a process of reform. The Jiang Zemin generation brought China into a broad international economic system. The Hu Jintao generation sort of took a pause from big activities internationally. And Xi is trying to combine some of the ideology of the Mao period with the necessities that have evolved as a result of the technology and the global economics. So Xi is undergoing, it's leading a major reform of the Chinese system as it has evolved in the previous period. But of course he's doing it in a technology that is totally different. When I first came to China in 1971, we had practically no capacity to telephone the United States from China. There were no traffic gridlocks in Beijing because there was no traffic, there were no high-rise buildings, there was no internet, there was no... Almost everything that most of your listeners would take for granted didn't exist. As late as 1976, the trade of the United States with Honduras in Central America was greater than the trade with China. So the objective conditions now are hugely different. And the Chinese leader now has to deal with a technology and the means of communication and of an interaction with America that did not exist at the beginning.
Does he have traits? Does President Xi have traits that remind you of Mao? I mean, you used to talk philosophy with Mao. You had very broad-ranging conversations with Mao and Zhou.
Well, they were very conceptually oriented, and it is right. I had what would be considered philosophical conversations with both of them. But every Chinese leader that I have met is in a way more conceptual than American leaders. And the reason is this, one of the reasons is this: Americans think a stable world is normal. And so when the world isn't stable, there is a problem. When there's a problem, you solve the problem and then you go on to something else. Chinese leaders think that a solution of a problem is an admissions ticket to another problem. So almost every Chinese leader that I've ever met has wanted to think in a conceptual way of policy as a process rather than as a program. So in that sense, they're all similar. Mao, of course, was much more ideological. And there are significant differences in that sense. But I've often been struck by the fact that if you look at a picture of a Chinese emperor receiving foreigners, it's very similar to a picture of a Chinese leader receiving a foreigner. There is the same half circle of chairs. There is a protocol that makes you feel you are moving into a very important encounter. And so I believe there's a certain continuity to Chinese culture that is important in understanding it.
Since 1949, we of course have not had a leader who has not lived through, a Chinese leader who has not lived through incredible instability.
Right.
That all 5 generations have seen chaos in China.
And that's also their big fear. I mean, all leaders in China have the fear of a breakdown of order and of chaos. Mm-hmm. And they identify that chaos also with what happened in the 19th century when China became subjugated by foreign countries.
And they've all either been part of or lived through the Cultural Revolution, with the current leader, even before the Cultural Revolution, having been sent down to Shanxi to...
Well, almost every Chinese that I've known has been affected by the Cultural Revolution. And he says that it strengthened him.
Yeah.
But it still was a unique experience to be taken out of your familiar context, sent to the countryside and having to work in the agricultural fields.
Yeah.
Zhu Rongji, who was prime minister to Jiang Zemin, was there for 10 years.
Yeah, it's interesting to speculate about it. At some point, assuming China remains stable, there will be a leader who has not experienced this instability, and will his or her reactions be very different from the previous? Obviously, it's going to be seventh or eighth generation before that happens.
Well, one of the aspects of China is that, as you say, not just the instability, the generation after the economic evolution, after China began to become a major industrial country, have a different life experience. The family does not have the same significance when people move into the cities from having lived in the countryside. So those are important changes that are going on.
As you would expect, we have a lot of questions about our election and U.S.-China relations. This one is from Frank from Chicago, which says both Secretary Clinton and Donald Trump have opposed ratification of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. How would the ratification or non-ratification affect U.S.-China relations?
Well, China is not
a party
yet a party of the Trans-Pacific relationship, but it should be. So one should think of it in two stages. The Trans-Pacific relationship is important because the United States ought to create organic, non-military relationships with Asia, and it should be part of the structure of the Pacific through a partnership with Asia. So this should be created in order to prevent a split between Asia and the United States that would lead to great difficulties. Secondly, once the partnership is ratified, it should be open to China. And I think China should be an important element in it. And I say this because I'm convinced we are in a period where China is rising, the United States is evolving a new kind of policy. And if the thing we are aware of is constant adversarial relationships, then it will lead to a crisis sooner or later. So I favor any reasonable relationship that strengthens the ties across the Pacific and to create, if possible, an organic relationship between the United States and China.
Harry from Denver, Colorado asks, if you were to sit down with the next president, what advice would you give him or her on the U.S.-China relationship? What would you tell them to do first?
I think the first thing I would tell them to do is to put a man on their personal staff, a man or a woman, on their personal staff who knows something about China's history and culture and who can act as a liaison to the Chinese government. And he should be watching the many things that go on in the interaction to make sure that they follow a coherent theme. Secondly, I would use him.
But isn't that part of your old job as National Security Advisor? Or
well, when
or
I was
National
Security Advisor, the job of the National Security Advisor was powerful, but I had 60 people on my staff. the National Security Advisor now has 700 people on the staff, so it's almost a different job. It's a major administrative job. So yes, it's the role of the National Security Advisor, but he cannot do all of this. And the second thing the president ought to do is, rather than adjudicate every dispute that goes on in trade or the South China Sea or wherever, he ought to try to sit down with a group of the key people he trusts to ask the questions: where are we trying to go? What are we trying to achieve? What are we trying to prevent? And then try to get a dialogue with the Chinese leaders on the same set of questions. Because otherwise there's always the danger that when you are so interconnected as we now are with communications and trade, that a lot of disputes come to the surface that are perfectly valid disputes, but they prevent you from getting a sense of perspective.
Do you think the Obama-Xi Sunnylands meeting is a good kind of model for what should go on early in the next administration with the new president and President Xi?
It was a good model, and in order to judge it, you really ought to judge or to know what they actually said to each other. And there's always the danger or the temptation when you have a summit meeting that the public relations people script what is going on. But as a model, yes, I think it's a good thing to do.
That struck me as somewhat similar to you taking a stroll with Zhou Enlai and having these very...
Except I had no cameras there.
You had no camera, no script, but when you wrote about them, the discussions really, that's why earlier on I described them as philosophical. It really was discussion of history, discussion of worldview, discussion of...
It was amazing to me when I first came to China. I really knew very little about China because I couldn't ask the bureaucracy, since we didn't tell them I was going. And I was struck when Zhou Enlai met with us. He usually liked to start in the afternoon, but then he would meet for 5-6 hours, and he didn't seem to be bothered by any other business. And so we had long periods of discussion, and we both had come to the conclusion that we should be honest with each other about our directions, our purposes. Well, anyway, that's how these talks developed. It's harder to do now with modern machinery, but it still should be attempted.
Isabella from Orlinda, Tennessee asks, what are the greatest challenges the U.S.-China relationship will face in the near future?
Well, all these questions are good. There are a number of ongoing problems, like the South China Sea problem, which we, of course, which needs attention. Another important problem is whether we can develop a common policy towards North Korea. Because here is a state that is developing nuclear weapons, developing missiles, which constitutes a threat to all the surrounding area in Asia, and in the long term also to the United States. And it is a neighbor of China, and there's a long history of threats to the security of China evolving through Korea. So is it possible for us to develop a common policy towards Korea. Third issue will be the evolution of China into the status of a superpower and how one interacts, because we have never had to deal with another superpower. China has never had to deal. Well, we've had to deal with Russia. But our interaction with Russia was almost entirely geostrategic. There was next to no economic relationship between China and the United States, between Russia and the United States. Between China and the United States, there are daily hundreds of contacts. So to bring these into some systematic framework, I would think is a big challenge and opportunity.
Which fits into the next question, which is from Marco in Worcester, Mass. Do you worry about the cordial relationship between Russia and China? Should that be a concern that they're moving back together?
Well, you know, there are two levels to answer this. One, even if you're concerned, it's a mistake to admit it. And I think, I really believe we in America have to develop a view of what our national interest is and not fluctuate it with every election. The Chinese usually have a view of their long-term relationship. China and the United States have a long border. China and Russia have a long border and a long history of interaction. So it's natural that they should cooperate. Of course, we would not like to have both of them as enemies of the United States. And we would, in the normal course of events, prefer to have friendly relations with both of them. And I would think that any thoughtful American president would make that as his objective. But am I concerned? Well, I'm concerned when the United States looks as it has no relevance to a lot of problems that exist around the world. But I think that's an issue for America, and we have to help ourselves with respect to that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned North Korea, but now China's relationship, because of the agreement to deploy THAAD, the relationship between China and South Korea has become more tense, and it remains fairly tense with Japan. What's the way forward on kind of China-South Korea relations, China-Japan relations? And that's asked by Vincenzo from Accord, New York.
A lot of this depends on what happens in North Korea. If North Korea builds up nuclear forces and acts as a threat to the security of the region, then this almost automatically produces a South Korean reaction. Right. Now, and of course, given the geographic proximity of North Korea and China, any weapon we put into South Korea to help our South Korean allies can have implications for China because it has capabilities. You can't, the territory is so relatively small. So I would think that if the North Korean problem could be solved, that is to say, if nuclear weapons and missiles could be removed from North Korea, some of the countermeasures with respect to them in South Korea would have a different character. And so I would imagine that if the North Korean issue were ever solved in a coherent way, that the deployment of high technology weapons in all of Korea could become a subject of negotiations. But in the present situation, it's possible that weapons in North Korea threaten Japan and us, and weapons in South Korea threaten China, and that's what makes it a tense situation.
Yeah. Are you optimistic? Very simple. Are you optimistic that we'll see some movement, some progress on that issue? That's a very optimistic scenario you painted, but you think there's any likelihood?
I think it is so obviously in the interest of the two sides that some solution, maybe not as comprehensive a solution as I mentioned, it's likely, yes.
This is from U Donghui in Falls Church, Virginia, about Taiwan. Since the 70s, when we established diplomatic relations with China, Taiwan has changed dramatically, and China is obviously more powerful. Is there a path forward for cross-strait relations, and what should the United States do?
Well, of course, not every problem in the world can be solved by the United States alone. What was achieved in that first meeting between Mao and Nixon, or in that visit, was the following. Before that, there had been 162 meetings that I mentioned.
Right.
And they were very ritualistic. The Chinese would say that Taiwan should be turned over to them, and the Americans would say they want an assurance of peaceful process. What happened in the meetings when Nixon was in China was that we accepted the principle that there was only one China, that we were not supporting a two-China solution. The Chinese accepted the principle that this would take time to evolve. And since then, it has evolved. And so the question is whether the interaction that is developing between the Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Straits will grow stronger and stronger. That's an unsettled issue that the future will have to decide.
From Santa Fe, what do you think are some of the missteps that have occurred in the U.S.-China relationship? Obviously, none could have occurred when you were Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, but since then?
On the Chinese, partly because their experiences in the 19th century and in general are extremely sensitive about American intervention in their domestic affairs. And on the other hand, it is impossible for an American president not to include some idea of general human rights in the American program. So how to meet the needs of both countries is important. We have not always handle that well. In the early stage of the Clinton administration, we made some public demands on China for alteration in their practices. But after 2 years, President Clinton changed that approach, and after that, relations on that issue became very good. I think in general, in the handling of South China Sea issues, for example, it is, of course, both sides are making military moves. But when we put television cameras on our warships, when they cruise around, we are presenting a challenge that I think we should avoid. The Chinese, on the same time, have to consider things, our sensitivities. But actually, if you look at the relationship between China and the United States since 1971, you can say that it's the most consistent American policy. Yeah. Every American administration, Democratic or Republican, has supported the statement that you made at the beginning, that the relationship between our two countries is the key element for peace and progress in the world. Mm-hmm. And there really hasn't been a big difference between Democratic and Republican administrations in the pursuit of that objective. During election periods, a lot of statements have been made, but I think I'm optimistic that after the election, the major outlines of the policy, the major goals, will be pursued.
Yeah. There really has not been a Republican-Democratic divide. It's much more been a party in power and a party out of power divide.
Exactly.
The party out of power is criticizing the party in power.
That's exactly right.
And that's been part of it. I'm surprised you didn't mention the Li Donghui visit to the United States. Do you think that was a foreign policy mistake when the president of Taiwan came to Cornell to participate in, and he was an alumnus, to participate, and that then generated enormous tension.
I had forgotten about that.
In the relationship.
That certainly caused some serious difficulties.
Yeah, caused some.
And it was repeated.
I'm sorry?
It has not happened again.
Yes, it has not. Yes, so one could argue that we learned from that decision. This comes from Twitter. Holden Fitzgerald. What are the implications of the emerging protectionist attitudes within America, and how does that affect U.S.-China relations?
Well, if America becomes really protectionist, which I don't think will happen, but assuming it does, and if then other countries follow the same, and if the whole world gets encapsulated again in a trade war pattern, then the benefits of global trade will disappear. Probably the standard of living everywhere will be affected, and the consciousness that we are adversaries will rise, and that would be a very unfortunate outcome.
From Scottsdale, Arizona, Julian Howay asks, do you agree with the prediction that, say, by 2050, China will be the next superpower because it will have by far the largest economy in the world? And what would that look like from the U.S. perspective?
Well, that's the objective. that President Xi has said. He has said the goals of China should be that the 100 years after the founding of the Communist Party, that's in 2021,
Right.
where they're supposed to reach the level of the poorer countries of Europe. 2049, 100 years after the founding of the People's Republic. If you have two elaborated major states with all the complicated technology of the present period, whose interaction has not been tested by experience, you have a huge challenge to statesmanship. And President Xi has said that one should look for partnership rather than adversarial, and for a win-win relationship. I agree with that. How to do it, it's a huge challenge if this happens without having worked on a world order, which is more trustful, more stable, and more balanced than the present one.
When you talk with Chinese leaders, what do you tell them on how actions that they can take to improve the U.S.-China relationship? What can they do to make the relationship more constructive and productive?
When I talk to Chinese leaders, I try to give them an honest account of what I think is important in improving the relationship. Some of it is actions by the United States, sometimes it's actions by them. They should not act from a posture of strength and superiority. We should not act from a posture of teaching them how to behave in the international world. And so I have had dialogue now with Chinese leaders for nearly 50 years. And I'm not saying it always succeeded, but I think it's always been respectful. And on the whole, this is also true of our national conduct. Our relations with China, if you consider all the interactions, are not so bad.
I agree. I mean, they're, as we always say, they're
they're
deep and complex. There's some areas where they're bad.
There have to be problems.
Yes, some.
That's inherent in the nature of the interaction. There will never be a day where we can say now but
it's important. It's important we convey those problems when we talk to the Chinese leadership. We convey those problems, and we convey not only what the U.S. government can do to solve them, but what the Chinese government. I think, when we hosted President Xi and you and at dinner in Seattle, and he then went on and spoke and came to Washington and met with President Obama, and the cyber issue was terribly corrosive on the relationship. Businesses felt they were being hacked, their IPR was being stolen, it was being used by Chinese companies. It doesn't get a lot of media attention, but that's improving.
No, they made considerable progress.
That has been, so that when these issues are conveyed to the Chinese leadership by people like you, I think, or the President of the United States, it has an effect. Yeah, it has effects. So, Norman Kaplan from Cleveland, Ohio. Donald Trump has said he would reconsider the United States security arrangements with Japan and South Korea, and even allow them to acquire their own nuclear weapons. How do you think that would affect the region, and how do you think China would respond?
Well, the acquisition of nuclear weapons by Japan and Korea, especially given the history of Chinese relationships with Japan, would have a dramatic effect. It would surely increase the level of tension. It would lead to some kind of military competition, and it would be an outcome that we should be very eager to avoid, and we certainly should not bring it about by withdrawing existing arrangements we have and telling these countries they have to depend on their own technology, especially since they have a technology from which they can move into nuclear weapons with relative ease. So I did not think this is a statement that if Mr. Trump were to be elected, he should honor. I think it's a statement he shouldn't have made because it's not helpful to the situation.
Do you think the Chinese understand, there have been a lot of, as in many campaigns, there are a lot of anti-China statements made in the course of campaigns. Does that have a corrosive effect on the U.S.-China relationship, or do the Chinese basically get it? It's a political campaign.
Well, they get it as a political campaign on one level. But on the other level, they would ask themselves, these statements get made because there must be an audience for them. And so if there is a very big audience for anti-Chinese statements, whatever the administration tells them, they may not be able to control it. So that irresponsible statements about China cannot always be ignored as being a campaign rhetoric. And we have to develop a national ability to bring our public statements in line with our national necessities.
Yeah. When I made that statement to a senior elected official in the United States, his response with a smile on his face was, well, you think the statements on taxation and Social Security and terrorism are more accurate? So, point being, we're not engaging in great dialogue on any level. We apparently have a viewer in Sweden who asks, Zebulon Carlander, do you believe there is a policy area where we could tap untapped potential for U.S.-China cooperation?
You know, this is sort of unorthodox. There is a proposal, so-called Silk Road proposal, on developing an infrastructure set of projects in Central Asia. And this was turned down earlier in this administration. I actually think and hope that the new administration will take another look at it, because the development of infrastructure in these somewhat backward regions now, it's not a militarily significant issue. So I think this is an area where we can cooperate. Funnily enough, I think Afghanistan is an area where we can cooperate. And as China grows towards the objectives that were described, there are a number of peacekeeping operations. They're participating in the anti-pirate efforts off the coast of Africa.
I think those are all great suggestions. A final question from Bobby Dietrich from Oakland, California. He wants to know, what's your favorite Chinese food?
I like the sweet and sour dishes.
The sweet and sour dishes. That works. Of course, my answer is
But
always,
I like the Szechuan food too, the spicy food.
well, it's a wonderful way to end what has been a fabulous hour. Dr. Kissinger, thank you so much for being our vice chair. Thank you so much for giving of your time tonight. Thank you so much for the contribution that you have made to peace and prosperity and the U.S.-China relationship. It has really been an honor and a pleasure to be with you tonight. And thank all of the venues for being with us tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.